It was early March 2024 when a small construction crew was sent to clear out a stretch of farmland outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a place that had sat untouched for over 5 decades. The land was being prepped for redevelopment, the old barns were collapsing, and weeds had eaten through every inch of soil. On what seemed like an ordinary morning, one of the operators noticed the excavator's bucket strike something unusually hard beneath the dirt. The machine jolted, sparks flew, and a hollow metallic thud echoed through the empty field. When they brushed away the soil, what they found didn't belong there. A large, steel military trunk, half buried and sealed tight, its surface covered in rust dents and what looked disturbingly like old burn marks. Curious, the crew gathered around as the site foreman tried to pry open the lid with a crowbar. It wouldn't budge. That's when one of them noticed the faint engraving on the front panel, barely visible through the corrosion. David Reynolds, U.S., ARMY 1959. The men exchanged puzzled looks. Nobody recognized the name, and this wasn't a known military site. In fact, the nearest base was over 60 miles away. When they tapped on the trunk, it gave off a dull, hollow sound, followed by a faint metallic vibration, almost like something inside had shifted. For a brief second, one of the workers swore he heard something move, a scraping noise from within, like metal dragging across metal, but the others dismissed it as the echo of the tools. The crew reported their find to local authorities, who immediately cordoned off the area. What had started as a normal workday now felt different, heavier, quieter, as if the land itself was holding its breath. While waiting for the police to arrive, one of the men lit a cigarette and stared at the trunk from a distance. He later said that, in the sunlight, the metal surface seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat beneath the rust. No one believed him at first, but the story spread fast. And by the time the sheriff's department showed up, a small crowd had gathered at the fence line. What none of them knew yet was that this wasn't just an old military box. It was a time capsule of something that was never meant to resurface. When investigators traced the name David Reynolds, they discovered that he had once been a 26-year-old communications specialist stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, during the late 1950s. Reynolds was described by his peers as sharp, disciplined, and the kind of man who followed every rule down to the letter. But in October 1959, during what was supposed to be a routine radio test in a rural training zone of Pennsylvania, he vanished without a trace. His team claimed they last heard his voice through the headset just after midnight. Calm, precise, reporting static interference in the forest around him. And then silence. His radio signal cut off abruptly, and search teams scoured the woods for days. Not a single footprint, not a shred of clothing, not even the equipment he'd been carrying was ever found. Officially, the Army filed his disappearance as unauthorized absence, presumed desertion, after weeks of fruitless searching. But some of his former squad mates never believed that. One of them, Sergeant Henry Lyle, later said in an interview that Reynolds had been acting strange in the days before he went missing, claiming he'd heard his own voice, calling his name from outside the camp, and that someone or something was mimicking him from the woods. Others dismissed it as paranoia caused by isolation and cold weather, but Henry said there was something deeper in Reynolds' eyes, a look that said he'd seen something he couldn't explain. After the military shut the case, his name quietly faded into forgotten records. His family moved out of state, and the Reynolds case became just another Cold War-era mystery. But what truly unsettled investigators in 2024 wasn't just that the trunk belonged to a soldier declared missing more than 6 decades earlier. It was where it was found. The abandoned farm where the trunk was buried had never been used for military activity, and the nearest training zone was over 50 miles away. The soil analysis later revealed that the ground around the trunk had been disturbed sometime between 1963 and 1967, years after Reynolds had already disappeared, meaning someone had dug it up or returned to bury it long after he was gone. What no one could explain was how an ordinary soldier could vanish in 1959 and somehow have his belongings buried years later, miles away from where he was last seen alive. When county investigators finally managed to unseal the trunk, the first thing that hit them was the smell. A suffocating mix of diesel fuel, rotted fabric, and something disturbingly sweet like spoiled fruit. The interior was surprisingly well preserved despite the years underground, as if it had been protected by the metal itself. Inside, everything was arranged with military precision. A U.S. Army uniform neatly folded, an old canteen half filled with murky liquid, a few cracked Polaroid photos, and a combat knife stained with what appeared to be rust, or maybe something else entirely. Each object looked like it hadn't aged a day since the 1950s, even though the air around it was cold and stale, as if sealed in a vacuum. The eerie stillness inside that trunk felt intentional, like a tomb built to contain more than just objects. Near the bottom, one of the officers found something that didn't belong to any military inventory. A small glass jar, tightly sealed and wrapped in cloth. When unwrapped, the jar revealed a dark, powdery residue mixed with tiny white fragments that were later confirmed to be human teeth. Someone had taken the time to label it in fading black ink. Recovered July 1964. The investigators exchanged glances, confused by the date, 5 years after David Reynolds had vanished. Beneath the jar was a folded sheet of paper with a set of coordinates scribbled across it, coordinates that pointed back to the very same farmland where the trunk had been buried. One of the younger deputies whispered, "It's like he knew this would be found." The lead officer quickly shut the trunk, but not before noticing something else wedged in a corner. A small, leather-bound book, covered in soot and stamped with the initials DR. When they opened the book, they realized it wasn't just a diary, it was a logbook filled with short, precise entries written in military shorthand. The first few pages described normal supply checks and weather reports, but the later entries took a disturbing turn. They mentioned night activity near camp, hippos in the forest, and duplicate signals coming through the radio. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, words scratched out, ink smudged as if written in a panic. The final entries were dated between 1959 and 1965, 6 years beyond his recorded disappearance. It was impossible, but the logbook didn't lie. The last words on the final page were smeared in dirt and blood, but one line remained clear enough to read, "They keep calling my name. I buried what I could. The rest won't stay buried." The logbook quickly became the centerpiece of the investigation. Experts from the military archives were brought in to analyze it, and what they found only deepened the mystery. The earliest pages, written in David Reynolds' tidy, disciplined handwriting, described his final assignment before his disappearance. He'd been sent with a small team to monitor strange radio interference detected near the Appalachian foothills believed to be from Soviet transmission tests. But as the entries continued, his tone changed from professional to paranoid. He wrote about hearing his name whispered through static, voices that matched the cadence and tone of his own, calling out commands he'd never given. He began to record timestamps of incidents. Moments when the air grew unnaturally still, when the compass needles spun in circles, and when his reflection in his field mirror appeared to be smiling back even when he wasn't. Midway through the logbook, investigators noticed something chilling. The handwriting shifted completely. The letters grew sharper, heavier, the spacing uneven. Forensic analysts concluded it was still Reynolds' handwriting, but altered, as if written by someone mimicking his style. These later entries became fragmented and incoherent, filled with military jargon that made no sense, codes that didn't exist in any army system. He wrote of shadows taking formation, the duplicate walking at night, and repeatedly mentioned a figure he called the Echo. One passage described watching his own silhouette step out of the tent after midnight, even though he swore he hadn't moved. From that night onward, the tone of his entries changed completely. He started signing off every page with a new date, but the dates extended years beyond 1959, stretching into 1964 and 1965, long after he'd been declared missing. By the final few pages, the writing looked frantic, desperate, written in what appeared to be a mix of ink and blood. He described burying the trunk as an act of containment, not preservation. He claimed that whatever had followed him during those nights wasn't human anymore, and that burying the items might anchor it beneath the soil. The last full entry ready, I dug the hole. I buried the trunk. If I'm still here tomorrow, I'll bury myself next. But below that, scrawled in a completely different handwriting, smaller, thinner, and trembling, were the words, "He didn't bury himself, I did." No one could determine who wrote that final line, but the ink tested decades newer than the rest. It was as if someone else had returned years later to finish the story he couldn't. After the discovery, the trunk and its contents were transferred to a state preservation facility in Harrisburg for further analysis. Security was tightened, with 24-hour surveillance and motion sensors placed around the sealed evidence chamber. For the first few nights, everything seemed normal until the early morning of April 17, 2024. At precisely 3:09 a.m., a motion alarm triggered inside the archive room. When guards reviewed the footage, what they saw left even the most seasoned officers speechless. Standing just a few feet from the military trunk was a dark figure, tall and rigid, dressed in what looked unmistakably like a 1950s U.S. Army uniform. The figure didn't move for nearly 30 seconds. It simply stood there, facing the camera, head slightly tilted, as though it knew it was being watched. Then, without any visible motion, the feed distorted with static, and the figure vanished. The trunk, however, was now slightly ajar, its lid no longer fully sealed. The next morning, investigators arrived to find the logbook missing. The lock on the evidence container showed no signs of tampering, and no fingerprints were found, not even from the staff who had last handled it. Stranger still, the temperature inside the room had dropped nearly 15 degrees overnight, and frost had formed on the metal surfaces, despite the heating system running. A trail of faint boot prints, caked with dry soil, led from the trunk toward the exit door. The pattern was confirmed to match the combat boot sole design issued to soldiers in 1958, a style that hadn't been manufactured for decades. One of the guards, who had been stationed in the hallway that night, later reported hearing a low humming sound, like a radio frequency, followed by a single whispered word through his walkie-talkie, Reynolds. In the days that followed, rumors spread among the preservation staff. Some swore they saw movement on the security monitors even when the cameras weren't recording. A shadow pacing the corridor, always near the evidence room. Others claimed the trunk had shifted position overnight, even though it was bolted to the floor. A maintenance worker quit after saying he heard knocking sounds coming from inside the trunk, slow and deliberate, as if someone was trapped beneath the metal. Despite multiple security audits and electrical tests, no logical explanation was ever found. What began as a military relic investigation had turned into something far darker. A mystery that seemed to blur the line between the living and the long buried. So who or what really came back that night? Was it the restless spirit of Private David Reynolds, trying to reclaim what was once his, or had something else taken his name, his face, and his uniform all those years ago? The trunk was sealed again and placed deep in state storage, this time under military jurisdiction, its location classified. But locals near the old Harrisburg farm say that on quiet nights, when the wind drifts across the empty fields, you can still hear radio static humming faintly from underground, followed by a voice calling through the static, calm, clear, and distinctly human, repeating the same line over and over again. This is Reynolds, still waiting for extraction. Oh, and maybe that's the truth behind it all. Maybe some missions never end, even after the soldier is gone.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.